I gifted my parents a trip, but they brought along my annoying older brother.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Paul stepped into the breakfast room, where the early sunlight poured through the large windows, creating a cozy yet slightly pressurized atmosphere. Today was a special day for him. After months of preparation and anticipation, he was finally about to share his surprise plan with the family. His heart pounded, not just with excitement but also with a hint of anxiety. He had always yearned for his parents' recognition, something he hadn't felt since he was a child. "Good morning." Paul smiled, placing a paper bag on the table that contained plane tickets he had carefully selected over the past 2 years. His father, Robert, looked up from his newspaper, offering a faint smile. "Good morning, son. You seem particularly excited today." His mother, Carrie, who was making coffee, also glanced over, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Is there something special happening, Paul?" Paul sat down and took a deep breath, his eyes gleaming. "I have a surprise for you. A trip to Europe. I've arranged everything: plane tickets, hotels, and a list of amazing destinations. I want to use this time to make up for everything we've missed. We'll go as a family." Carrie set her coffee cup down, her surprise evident. "Europe? Did you really do this? That's wonderful, Paul." Robert chuckled heartily. "Wow, you're so thoughtful. We're very proud of you." Paul felt warmth in his heart. This was the moment he had been longing for. But just as he was about to say more about his plan, the door suddenly swung open. James, Paul's older brother, appeared. His disheveled appearance, rumpled clothes and dark circles under his eyes contrasted sharply with the fake smile on his face, which made Paul uncomfortable. "Good morning, family." James pulled out a chair and sat down, ignoring the presence of the paper bag on the table. He turned to Paul, his voice dripping with exaggerated sweetness. "You seem excited today, little brother. What's going on?" Paul tried to stay calm, but his voice turned cold. "It's just a family matter, James." James raised an eyebrow, his sharp gaze almost challenging. "Oh, family? Well, I'd love to join in. Consider it a chance for us all to bond, right?" Carrie immediately chimed in, her face lighting up with joy. "That's right, James. This trip will be amazing if both of you are there." Paul felt a chill run down his spine. "But Mom, this trip was something I planned specifically for you and Dad. I wanted it to be special." James cut him off, his tone dismissive. "Paul, why are you being so selfish? We're family, after all." Robert nodded in agreement. "James is right. Our family needs moments like these. You've already arranged everything, surely you can share a bit of this joy with your brother." Paul stared at his parents, feeling like he was being pushed aside. He struggled to control his emotions, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "I spent 2 years saving and planning for this trip. It's not just an ordinary vacation." Carrie gently placed her hand on Paul's shoulder, but her words felt like a knife cutting into his soul. "Paul, you're so thoughtful. But James needs to relax too. Don't you want the whole family to be happy?" Paul felt suffocated. Memories came flooding back like a tidal wave: birthdays when James received expensive gifts while he got only a few half-hearted words of encouragement, times when James asked their parents for money without facing any criticism while Paul had to work hard to prove himself. The unfairness was like an old wound that had never healed. James looked at Paul, his smirk filled with provocation. "Thanks, little brother, for taking care of everything. I'm sure this trip will be fantastic." Paul clenched his fists, trying to suppress his anger. "James, this isn't about you. It's about Mom and Dad." But James only laughed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Paul. I just want to help make it more fun for everyone." Paul turned to his parents, hoping they would understand. But their eyes held only support for James. He realized that, in their eyes, he was never the one deserving of priority. "Fine," Paul said softly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "If everyone wants James to come, I won't object." Carrie smiled, oblivious to the pain in her son's eyes. "That's the spirit, Paul. The family needs to stick together." Paul stood up and left the room, feeling as though all his efforts had been trampled on. He went to his room and looked at the suitcase he had carefully packed. The tickets, the plans, everything had been filled with hope for a better family connection. But now, all that remained was emptiness. Downstairs, James grinned triumphantly, already scheming to insert himself into the trip, while Paul's parents remained oblivious to the hurt they had just inflicted on the son who had always given his all for them. Paul stood silently in his room, staring at the meticulously packed suitcase. The neatly folded clothes, the detailed itinerary documents, and the carefully arranged plane tickets, each item represented 2 years of planning and saving, fueled by his longing for family acknowledgement. Yet now, it all seemed meaningless. He felt like a stranger in his own home. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Paul, are you okay?" His mother's voice, gentle and concerned, came from the other side. Paul took a deep breath, trying to suppress his emotions. "I'm fine, Mom." The door opened, and Carrie stepped inside, her expression tinged with uncertainty. "I know you've worked so hard on this. But don't be so sensitive. James just wants the family to be closer." Paul turned around, his gaze icy. "Closer? Or does he just want to barge into everything I do?" Carrie sighed softly. "Paul, James has had a tough time. You're stable in your career, successful. But James is still struggling. Your father and I just want both of you to be happy." Paul let out a bitter laugh, devoid of any humor. "You always say that. I work hard, trying my best to do good things for this family. And what does he do? Just show up and get unconditional love." "Paul," Carrie hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Enough. I don't want to argue anymore," Paul said coldly. "If you've already decided, I won't say anything else." Carrie looked at her son for a long moment, then shook her head slightly and quietly left the room. The door closed, leaving Paul drowning in heavy thoughts. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was stifling. In the living room, James lounged comfortably on the sofa, a TV remote in hand, his eyes glued to the screen. Robert and Carrie sat nearby, occasionally chatting with James, their conversations light and filled with laughter. Paul descended the stairs, his eyes coldly observing the scene. He clenched his fists as he heard James call out. "Oh, Paul, by the way, I made a few tweaks to the trip. I just booked us a couple of extra days in Barcelona. Mom and Dad are going to love it." Paul froze. "What did you do?" James turned, flashing a smirk. "I thought your itinerary was a bit dull. I just wanted to spice it up. Mom likes fancy places, so I added a few upscale activities." Carrie quickly interjected, her tone soothing. "James just wants to make the trip more enjoyable, Paul. Don't stress yourself." Paul couldn't believe his ears. "You changed my itinerary without even asking me?" James shrugged. "We're family, no need to ask. Don't be so selfish." Robert put down his newspaper, his tone serious. "Paul, there's no need to make a big deal out of this. James is only trying to help." Paul felt his blood boil. He walked over, glaring at James. "You're taking advantage of Mom and Dad's kindness. This trip was something I planned specifically for them, not an opportunity for you to show off." James feigned surprise, then turned to his parents with a hurt expression. "I was just trying to help, and now I'm being accused." Carrie looked at Paul with concern. "Paul, you're being too harsh." Paul let out a bitter laugh. "So I'm the bad guy for trying to do something good for this family?" The room fell silent, the tension suffocating. Paul turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the three of them in the living room. The next day, Paul decided to review the entire itinerary. When he opened his email, he couldn't believe his eyes. James had altered almost every booking, luxury hotels, extravagant restaurants, and activities that were completely unrelated to the original plan. He had even added some of his friends to a few activities. Paul clenched his fists in anger and called the travel agency. "Hello, this is Paul Anderson. I'd like to confirm the details of my Europe trip." The agent's voice was polite. "Yes, Mr. Anderson. We've received the changes from James Anderson, and everything has been updated per his requests. James Anderson has no authority to make any changes. This is my trip." Paul shouted. "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. James provided all the necessary confirmation details." Paul hung up, frustration overwhelming him. He couldn't take it anymore. Storming down to the living room, he found James lounging casually, chatting with their parents. "James!" Paul's voice thundered. James looked up, feigning surprise. "What's the matter, little brother?" Paul threw the stack of itinerary papers onto the table. "You changed my entire plan. Who do you think you are?" James smirked. "I just made everything better." "No. You're destroying all my hard work." Paul growled. Robert stood up. "Paul, calm down. You're blowing this out of proportion." "You think so, too, Dad? I spent 2 years preparing everything, and now it's all trampled on by him." Paul snapped, glaring at his parents. Carrie shook her head. "Paul, you already have everything. Just let your brother have a little bit of it." Those words stabbed Paul like a knife to the heart. He stood motionless, the pain washing over him. James crossed his arms, looking at Paul with a challenging gaze. "Come on, don't make a big deal out of it. The trip is still happening." Paul said nothing more. He turned and walked away, each step heavy with disappointment and hurt. Paul sat silently in his room, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across his tense face. On the desk lay the itinerary papers, now crossed out and edited, the meticulous notes he had spent months perfecting now rendered meaningless. Every glance at them felt like another blow to his crushed efforts. He gripped a pen tightly in his hand, his red-rimmed eyes staring blankly into the void. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Paul, can I come in?" came the soft voice of Lucy, his cousin, from outside. Paul sighed. "Come in." Lucy entered, carrying a cup of hot tea. "I heard your mom talking. I know how much effort you put into this trip." Paul gave a small nod, not meeting her gaze. "But it's all meaningless now, Lucy. James has turned my trip into a joke." Lucy sat beside him, placing the tea on the table. "I know James tends to take things too far, but this time, it's just too much." Paul chuckled bitterly. "He's always like this, and my parents always take his side. They've never seen me as someone important." Lucy hesitated, then spoke softly. "You know, when I was little, I overheard my mom saying that your parents worry about James because he's not as capable as you. They're afraid he'll be left behind." Paul closed his eyes, bitterness rising within him. "And for that, they're willing to overlook everything I do?" Lucy remained silent, unsure of how to respond. Paul stood up, walking over to the window to gaze at the dark sky outside. "I've worked so hard, Lucy. Not to show off, but just to be recognized. Just once. But I guess that's impossible." Lucy gently placed her hand on Paul's. "Don't give up, Paul. You deserve respect." Paul nodded slightly, but inside, a deep sense of disappointment churned. The next morning, Paul woke up with a heavy heart. As he stepped into the kitchen, he saw James sitting with their parents, chatting and laughing. "Paul, you're up. I just booked us tickets for a museum tour in Paris. Mom and Dad will love it, James announced with a smug tone. Paul stared at his brother. What else have you changed? James shrugged. I'm just trying to make the trip more perfect. Paul turned to his parents, struggling to stay calm. Are you really okay with this? I planned everything carefully, down to the smallest detail. And now he's ruined it all. Carrie sighed. Paul, don't overreact. James just wants the best for the family. No. He just wants to control everything. Paul nearly shouted. Robert frowned. Paul, you're being childish. Those words felt like a heavy blow to Paul's self-esteem. He clenched his fists, trying not to lose control. So I'm wrong for wanting to do something meaningful for this family? James let out a mock sigh, placing a hand on Paul's shoulder. Relax, little brother. Don't stress so much. Paul shoved James' hand away, his gaze cold. Don't touch me. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one said another word. That afternoon, Paul received a message from an old friend Matthew. Matthew, I heard you're planning a big trip with your family. Honestly, I admire how thorough you always are. Paul stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. He typed a few lines but erased them. Finally, he sent back a short reply. Paul, it's not what you think. Matthew replied quickly. Matthew, what's wrong? If you need to talk, just give me a call. Paul thought for a moment before deciding to call Matthew. The phone rang, and Matthew picked up. Hey, Paul. What's going on? Paul sighed. Matthew, I feel like I'm being pushed out of my own family. There was a brief silence. Is it that bad? Matthew asked. Paul recounted everything. When he finished, Matthew let out a soft sigh. Paul, you've done so much for them. If they don't appreciate it, maybe it's time you start thinking about yourself. Paul remained silent. Matthew's words struck a chord within him, but deep down, he wasn't ready to give up. He still hoped his parents would understand his intentions. That night, Paul had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned, unsure of what to do next. Eventually, he got up and went downstairs for a glass of water. As he passed the living room, he overheard James on the phone. Don't worry, I've got this trip handled. Paul won't dare do anything. That guy only knows how to sit back and take it. Paul froze. It felt like his heart was being squeezed. He stood there for a moment, then turned and returned to his room, anger simmering inside him. Now he understood everything. James wasn't just thoughtless, he was intentionally trying to push Paul out of the trip. Paul clenched his fists, his eyes burning with determination. If his parents couldn't see the truth, he wouldn't stay silent anymore. The next morning, Paul woke up with a heavy heart. The frustration from overhearing James's phone conversation still weighed heavily on him. He headed downstairs, his cold gaze sweeping over the kitchen, where James was leisurely enjoying breakfast with their parents. Good morning, little brother. James greeted with a smug expression, as if nothing had happened. Paul didn't reply, only glaring at him. He decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. James, Paul began, his voice controlled but tense, we need to talk. James raised an eyebrow and shrugged. Oh. About what? I'm busy planning for the trip. Paul walked over and slammed the stack of itinerary papers onto the table. You're deliberately sabotaging this trip. Did you think I didn't hear what you said last night? James froze for a moment, then quickly regained his composure. What are you talking about? I have no idea what you mean. Paul looked straight into his brother's eyes, his voice cutting like ice. Don't pretend. I heard you on the phone, saying I wouldn't dare do anything. Did you think I'd stay quiet forever? Carrie set down her coffee cup, worry etched on her face. Paul, what are you talking about? Paul turned to his mother, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mom, I overheard him last night. He's using this trip to show off to his friends. He doesn't care about the family." James immediately countered. "You're making things up. Mom, don't listen to him. Paul's just jealous." Robert frowned. "Paul, you shouldn't accuse your brother without proof." Paul was stunned. "Accuse? You think I'm lying? I've worked so hard to plan this trip for you, and now it's all being ruined by him." James laughed mockingly. "Oh, come on. You always act like you're perfect. I'm just trying to make the trip more fun." Paul clenched his fists, his voice trembling with anger. "You don't care about making it fun. You just want to turn this trip into your personal show." Carrie interjected, her tone reproachful. "Paul, you're going too far. James is only trying to help." Paul felt like he couldn't breathe. "Help? He changed the entire itinerary without asking me. He even invited his friends. This trip was supposed to be for you and Dad." James shrugged, his expression defiant. "I only added a few people to make it more lively. What's the big deal?" Paul couldn't take it anymore. He turned and headed back upstairs, leaving the tense atmosphere behind. From a distance, Lucy had witnessed the entire exchange. Quietly, she followed Paul and knocked on his door. "Paul, can I come in?" Lucy asked softly. Paul opened the door, his face still flushed with anger. "Come in." Lucy stepped inside, gently closing the door behind her. "I saw everything. James went way too far." Paul sighed and sat down on his bed. "I don't understand why Mom and Dad always take his side. No matter what I do, it's never enough." Lucy hesitated. "What are you planning to do next?" Paul was silent for a moment before speaking quietly. "I don't know. But I can't let him keep controlling everything." Lucy nodded slightly. "I'm on your side. You need to set things straight." That afternoon, Paul decided to have a candid conversation with his parents. He found them in the living room. "Dad, Mom, I need to talk to you seriously," he said. Robert looked up. "What is it, Paul?" Paul took a deep breath. "I don't want James to join this trip." Carrie froze. "Paul, you can't do that. James is your brother." Paul remained firm. "Yes, but this is a trip I planned specifically for you and Dad. He's ruined everything." Robert's tone turned stern. "Paul, you're being too sensitive. You need to learn to share." Paul clenched his fists. "Share? I've been sharing my whole life. But I've never been acknowledged." James walked in from outside, smirking. "Oh, complaining again, are we?" Paul turned to James, his voice icy. "You have no right to be here." James shrugged. "I've already booked my tickets. There's nothing you can do about it." Robert stood up. "That's enough. Paul, if you can't accept James coming along, then maybe you need to reevaluate your attitude." Paul was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at his parents, feeling utterly betrayed. "Fine," Paul said softly, his voice cold. "If that's your decision, I have nothing more to say." He turned and walked away, his heart heavy. All his efforts and hopes for a meaningful trip had been reduced to disappointment. That evening, Paul sat silently in his room. He scrolled through family photos on his phone. In every picture, James was always the center of attention, while Paul stood on the sidelines. He turned off the screen, his gaze hollow. He realized he couldn't continue like this. But should he abandon the trip he had spent 2 years preparing for? Paul closed his eyes, his heart heavy with hurt and anger. No matter what he did, he was never the priority in his family. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at a crumpled plane ticket. The bold printed words on the ticket now seemed meaningless. Every effort he had poured into the trip felt obliterated by his parents' words and James's audacity. He felt like an outsider in his own family. A notification buzzed on his phone, pulling Paul out of his thoughts. It was a message from Lucy. "Lucy, are you okay? Things seem to be getting worse." Paul stared at the screen, then set the phone down without replying. He didn't know what to say. What was there to say when all his efforts had been trampled on? He stood up and went downstairs. In the living room, James was lounging comfortably on the sofa, phone in hand, laughing to himself. His parents sat nearby, their relaxed expressions showing no concern for the tension between their sons. Their indifference made Paul feel suffocated. "Where are you going, Paul?" Carrie asked as he walked past. "Out," Paul replied curtly without looking back. "Don't come back too late," Robert added, his tone lacking any real concern. Paul didn't respond, slamming the door behind him as he stepped out into the quiet street. The cold wind bit at him, but the anger inside him burned colder still. He kept walking, not knowing where he was headed. He just wanted to escape that house, that stifling atmosphere. As he passed a family cafe, Paul stopped. This was the place he often came to when he needed a moment of peace. He pushed the door open, the bell above jingling softly. "Paul?" a voice called from behind the counter. Paul looked up to see Matthew, his friend, who was working there. "Take a seat." "I'll make you a coffee," Matthew said, not asking any questions. Paul sat down at his usual corner table, resting his head in his hands. A few moments later, Matthew set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "You okay?" Matthew asked, his voice calm and warm. Paul was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know anymore. Everything's a mess." Matthew sat down across from him. "It's about your family, isn't it?" Paul nodded and began recounting everything from the 2 years he spent planning the trip, to James barging in and ruining it all, and how his parents not only didn't defend him but even called him selfish. Matthew listened in silence, occasionally nodding. When Paul finished, he spoke slowly. "You've done so much for them, Paul. But not everyone knows how to appreciate it." Paul sighed. "I thought if I tried hard enough, they'd finally see it." Matthew shook his head. "Effort doesn't always get the recognition it deserves. You need to know your own worth, Paul. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Paul looked at Matthew, his gaze softening. "Thank you." Matthew smiled faintly. "You're welcome. But what are you going to do now?" Paul remained silent. He didn't know. He was exhausted. Leaving the cafe, Paul wandered for a while before returning home. The house was quiet. He opened the door gently, trying not to make any noise. But as he entered the living room, he froze. James was sitting on the couch, his expression cold. "Where have you been, little brother?" James asked, his tone laced with mockery. Paul didn't answer, simply walking past him. But James wasn't done. "I heard from Mom that you went out to think. What are you planning? Cancel the trip?" James sneered. Paul stopped and turned to face his brother. "That's none of your business." James shrugged. "Just curious. After all, this trip is mine now." Paul clenched his fists but then relaxed them. "Enjoy it while you can. But don't think I'll keep tolerating this." James smirked. "What will you do? Complain to Mom and Dad? You know whose side they're on." Paul didn't respond. He turned and went up to his room, but anger boiled within him. He slammed the door shut, leaning against the wall and taking a deep breath. He knew that if this continued, he'd only end up tormenting himself. But he couldn't let James win. Paul opened his drawer and took out the trip documents. He began reviewing every detail James had changed. He needed to find a way to regain some control, no matter how small. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucy. "Lucy, James is bragging to his friends that this trip is all his doing. They even said they'll meet up in Barcelona." Paul gripped his phone tightly. So James hadn't just changed the plans, he'd involved his friends, too. Paul replied to Lucy. "Paul, thank you. I won't let this continue." Paul knew what he had to do. He couldn't let James keep taking advantage of their parents and turning his efforts into a joke. He was ready to fight back. Paul sat motionless on his bed, his empty gaze fixed on the disorganized itineraries strewn across the desk. The carefully crafted notes and meticulously planned destinations now seemed like meaningless scraps of paper. Anger and disappointment weighed heavily on him, pulling him deeper into a suffocating void. A soft knock on the door broke his train of thought. "Paul, can I come in?" Lucy's gentle voice called. Paul exhaled deeply. "Come in." Lucy stepped inside, her eyes filled with concern. "I heard Mom talking. I know you're really upset." Paul didn't respond, only shaking his head slightly. He didn't want to complain anymore. But Lucy wasn't giving up. "You can't let James do whatever he wants like this. You've spent 2 years preparing for this trip. You don't deserve to be treated this way." Paul clenched his fists. "I've tried explaining, but Mom and Dad won't listen." Lucy sat down next to him and spoke softly. "I understand how that feels. Ever since we were kids, the family's attention has always been on James. No matter what he does wrong, he's forgiven, while you're expected to be strong and responsible." Paul let out a bitter laugh. "Exactly. It's always been like that." Lucy held Paul's hand gently. "You shouldn't give up. If Mom and Dad can't see your efforts, let them realize their mistake on their own." Paul thought for a moment before nodding slightly. He couldn't keep enduring this injustice forever. The next morning, Paul came downstairs with a clear sense of determination. He was going to confront James, not to argue but to settle things once and for all. As he entered the dining room, he saw James casually enjoying breakfast, scrolling through his phone. "Good morning, little brother." James greeted smugly. Paul didn't respond. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his cold gaze fixed on James. "James, I want to talk to you," Paul said, his voice sharp. James raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "Oh. What's this about? Still upset about the trip?" Paul gritted his teeth. "You've gone behind my back, changed the itinerary, invited your friends, and ruined everything. This trip was meant for Mom and Dad, not for you to show off." James chuckled. "Come on, don't overreact. I just want Mom and Dad to have fun." Paul slammed his hand on the table, making the glass tremble. "You're not thinking about them at all. You're only thinking about yourself." Carrie walked in from the kitchen, her voice laced with reproach. "Paul! What are you doing? Why are you talking to your brother like that?" Paul turned to his mother, his voice strained. "Can't you see? He's taking advantage of your kindness and Dad's." James smirked. "Enough, Paul. If you can't handle it, just stay home. Don't ruin the family's atmosphere." Paul froze. James's words cut into him like a knife. He looked at his parents, hoping for some pushback, but all he got was silence. Robert set down his newspaper and spoke slowly. "Paul, you need to learn to compromise. James is part of this family too." Paul felt like his heart was being crushed. He stood, bitterness filling his gaze as he looked at each member of his family. "If that's how you all feel, then I have nothing more to say." He turned and walked out, leaving a heavy silence behind. Paul stepped outside, the icy wind biting at his skin, though it couldn't match the cold rage burning inside him. He walked aimlessly, needing to escape the stifling atmosphere of his home. He stopped in front of a family cafe, a place that had always been a refuge for him after exhausting days. Paul pushed the door open. "Paul. Are you okay?" Matthew, his close friend, called from behind the counter. Paul shook his head slightly and sat down. "Just a coffee." Matthew placed a steaming cup in front of him and sat across the table. "Family troubles?" Paul nodded faintly and recounted the entire story, from the trip preparations to James's interference. Matthew remained silent for a moment before speaking calmly. "Paul, if they can't see how important you are, let them figure it out on their own. You don't need to keep trying to please them." Paul closed his eyes. "I've tried so hard." Matthew placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, letting go is the only way for them to realize what they're losing." Paul sat in silence, contemplating Matthew's words. Perhaps he had been too fixated on seeking recognition. That evening, when Paul returned home, he found James on the phone. "Don't worry, this trip is mine now." "Paul won't do anything," James said with a mocking laugh. Paul stood frozen, each word cutting deep into him. But this time, he wasn't angry. Instead, he felt a profound sense of weariness. He turned and walked back to his room, pulling out his phone to send a message to Lucy. "Paul, I'm not going on the trip. They don't need me." Lucy replied quickly. "Lucy, don't do that. Don't let them win." Paul stared at the screen for a long time before turning off his phone. He sat in the dark, unmoving. He realized that no matter how much he tried, he could never overcome the favoritism his parents held for James. Paul sat quietly in his room, the soft yellow glow of the lamp casting shadows over his exhausted and disappointed face. The silence enveloped the space, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. His gaze fixed on the carefully packed suitcase sitting in the corner, a symbol of all the expectations and effort he had poured into the past 2 years. Now, it felt meaningless, much like his role in his family. His phone buzzed. Paul glanced at the screen. It was Lucy. "Lucy, are you really not going on the trip?" Paul hesitated, then typed a reply. "Paul, I have no reason to go anymore. This trip isn't mine anymore." Lucy responded almost instantly. "Lucy, don't let them push you out. You deserve to be appreciated." Paul set the phone down on his desk. He knew Lucy cared, but her words couldn't change the reality. His parents had chosen James. All of Paul's hard work had been dismissed. Laughter echoed from the living room, snapping Paul back to the present. He walked to his door and cracked it open to listen more closely. "I booked tickets for a concert in Paris. Mom and Dad are going to love it," James said confidently. Carrie's cheerful laugh followed. "Oh, James, you're so thoughtful." "Thank you." Paul clenched his fists as pain surged through him. Those were the words he had hoped to hear, the result of his efforts. But as soon as James inserted himself, all of it had been erased. Unable to endure it any longer, Paul stormed downstairs. The atmosphere in the living room shifted immediately as he entered. "Paul, come eat something," Carrie said gently. Paul ignored her, his cold gaze fixed on James. "What do you think you're doing?" James raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm just making the trip more fun. You should be thanking me." Paul stepped closer, his voice low. "You're not helping. You're ruining everything." Robert lowered his newspaper, frowning. "Paul, that's no way to talk. James is part of this family." Paul scoffed. "Family? Since when has this family considered me a part of it? Or is it just him?" Carrie sighed. "Paul, not this again. Not this again." Paul repeated, his voice heavy with bitterness. "I spent 2 years planning this trip. Every detail was carefully thought out to make you happy. And just because he stepped in, everything I did was erased." James stood, crossing his arms. If you're so upset, then stay home. No one's forcing you to come. Paul turned to his parents, hoping for some defense. But all he got was silence. He let out a bitter laugh. Fine. If that's what everyone wants, I won't say another word. He turned and walked away, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, haunted by everything that had happened. Memories of the past replayed in his mind: the birthdays where James received expensive gifts while he got only words of encouragement, the times James made mistakes but was shielded, while Paul was criticized for even the smallest errors. It was like a film looping endlessly in his head. He remembered the time he had to give up his tutoring lessons to take a part-time job and help pay for James's tuition after James lost his job. Paul hadn't complained, wanting only to keep the family stable. Yet now, all those sacrifices felt meaningless. The buzzing of his phone pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Lucy. "Hello," Paul answered, his voice hoarse. "Paul, I just overheard your mom telling Uncle Robert that the entire trip was organized by James. They've completely forgotten about you," Lucy said, her voice filled with concern. Paul tightened his grip on the phone. "I know. But I don't care anymore." Lucy hesitated. "What are you going to do?" Paul was silent for a moment. "I'm not going on the trip. Let them realize their mistake on their own." Lucy sighed. "Paul, please think it through." Paul hung up. There was nothing left to think about. His parents' silence and James's audacity had given him all the answers he needed. The next morning, as the family sat down for breakfast, Paul calmly pulled out a chair and took his seat. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. "I have something to say," Paul began. Robert glanced at him over the top of his newspaper. "What is it?" Paul looked directly at his parents, his gaze steady but resolute. "I'm not going on this trip." The room fell silent. Carrie set down her knife and fork. "Paul, what are you saying?" "I said, I'm not going," Paul repeated, his words clear and firm. James let out a laugh. "Oh, finally, you're seeing sense." Carrie looked distressed. "But you've planned everything. Why are you saying this now?" Paul sighed. "Because I've realized that no matter how much I try, I'll never be enough. You always side with him and dismiss everything I do." Robert's tone turned stern. "Paul, you're being disrespectful." Paul shook his head. "No, I'm just telling the truth." He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the three of them one last time. "I hope you all enjoy the trip." He turned and walked away, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with tension and silence. Paul sat quietly in his family room as the morning sunlight filtered through the window, casting soft light over the suitcase that remained untouched. He felt lighter than he had in days. Deciding not to go on the trip had freed him from the suffocating sense of injustice in his family. Now, he no longer had to fight for his parents' approval or compete with James for their attention. The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Paul glanced at the screen. It was a call from his father. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Paul said, his tone calm. "Paul, it's Dad," Robert's voice came through, lacking its usual firmness and instead tinged with hesitation. "I want to talk to you." Paul frowned slightly. "What is it?" There was a brief silence on the other end before Robert sighed. "Something went wrong on the trip." Paul stayed quiet, waiting. "James, he let us down. He pressured us to buy expensive things, made unreasonable demands. And when your mom got sick, he didn't care. He left us at the hotel to go out with his friends," Robert said, his voice growing heavy with regret. "Your mom and I were wrong not to listen to you." Paul closed his eyes, bitterness rising within him. He had anticipated this outcome, but hearing his father admit it still struck a chord. "So, what do you want me to do now?" Paul asked, his tone no longer cold but still guarded. I want to apologize, Robert said softly. We weren't fair to you. We need to talk when we get back. Can we do that? Paul was silent for a few moments before he nodded. Okay, Dad. The call ended. Paul set the phone down, his expression thoughtful. For the first time in his life, his father had admitted fault. It didn't bring joy but a strange mixture of relief and fragile hope. A week later, Paul stood by the door, hearing the car pull into the garage. The doors opened, and Robert and Carrie stepped out, their faces weary and heavy with emotion. James was nowhere to be seen. Paul slowly walked toward them. Hello, Dad, Mom, he greeted, his tone calm. Carrie looked at her son, her eyes filled with guilt. Paul, Robert placed a hand on her shoulder before stepping forward. Paul, we're sorry. Paul met his father's gaze. For what? Robert sighed. For not appreciating you. We were blind, always favoring James. This trip made us see everything clearly. Carrie's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Paul. I didn't know James could be so selfish. Paul stayed silent, his heart softening slightly. But forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Where's James? Paul asked, his tone neutral. Robert shook his head, his voice firm. He left to stay with his friends after arguing with us. I don't want to discuss him right now. Paul nodded. He understood that James was finally facing the consequences of his selfishness. Carrie stepped closer, taking Paul's hand. You've done so much for this family. I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner. Paul looked at his mother and, for the first time, felt genuine sincerity in her eyes. I just want you and Dad to be happy. I don't need anything else. Robert nodded. We know. And this time, we want to make things right. The tension in the house eased, replaced by a warmth Paul had long yearned for. Still, he wasn't completely at peace. One afternoon, as the family sat in the living room, Robert spoke up. Paul, your mother and I want to plan another trip. This time, just the three of us. Paul looked at his father in surprise. Are you sure? Carrie smiled warmly. We're sure. This time, we want it to be an opportunity for our family to truly reconnect. Paul studied his parents for a long moment, sensing their sincerity. I agree, Paul said softly. But I want this trip to be more than just sightseeing. I want it to be a chance for us to understand each other better. Robert smiled. I agree. Carrie nodded. So do I. A few weeks later, the new trip began. Paul and his parents arrived in Florencia, the city he had originally planned to visit. But this time, there were no packed schedules or lavish destinations. Instead, they chose small roadside cafes and quiet streets where they could sit and talk. In a small cafe bathed in the gentle afternoon sunlight, Paul sat across from his parents. They sipped their coffee and shared small stories about their lives. No pressure, no distance, just genuine connection. Robert chuckled lightly. I never thought just sitting here, drinking coffee, and watching the streets would feel this good. Carrie reached out and held Paul's hand. Thank you, Paul. Without you, we would never have realized what truly matters. Paul smiled faintly. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged in this family. Florencia wasn't just a destination for their trip, it was the start of healing for a broken family. The mornings in Florencia were gentle, with soft sunlight spilling over the historic streets. Paul and his parents sat in a cozy cafe, surrounded by warmth and serenity. The tension and distance that once divided them had dissolved, replaced by everyday conversations and genuine laughter. Carrie gently stirred her coffee, her gaze soft as she looked at her son. Paul, I still can't believe we're sitting here like this. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. Paul smiled slightly. I just wanted us to understand each other better. We don't need extravagant plans or luxury, just being together is enough. Robert nodded thoughtfully. I used to think expensive trips were the key to family happiness, but it turns out, moments like these are the most precious. Paul could see the change in his parents' attitudes. Their sincere regret lightened the weight on his heart, but he still felt a lingering concern. What do you plan to do about James? Paul asked, his tone calm but his eyes betraying a hint of worry. The atmosphere grew heavier. Robert set his coffee down, deep in thought. I've thought about it a lot. James needs to take responsibility for his actions. Carrie sighed, her voice tinged with guilt. I know I've spoiled him too much. But I can't continue like this anymore. Paul nodded slightly. I don't want our family to fall apart, but if he doesn't change, things can't get better. Robert spoke slowly. When we get home, I'll have a serious conversation with James. He needs to understand that selfishness and irresponsibility will no longer be tolerated. Paul said nothing more, gazing out the window at the smiling passers-by. He hoped James would realize his mistakes and change, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. A week later, the family returned to Madrid. The large house felt strangely quiet. A heavy atmosphere lingered, with James still absent. That evening, the doorbell rang. Robert opened the door to find James standing there, his face gaunt and his eyes weary. You're back. James said, his tone indifferent. Robert didn't reply immediately but stepped aside. Come in. We need to talk. James stepped inside and slumped onto the sofa. Paul came down the stairs, his gaze cold as it settled on his brother. You've done enough, James, Paul said, his tone sharp and filled with frustration. James smirked. Here we go again. Giving me a lecture. I didn't do anything wrong. Robert slammed his hand on the table, his voice stern. Enough, James. I cannot believe you treated your parents this way. We went on this trip to relax and enjoy ourselves, but you turned it into a disaster. Carrie chimed in, her voice trembling. You abandoned us, made unreasonable demands, and only thought about yourself. James crossed his arms, his attitude defiant. So what? Haven't you always favored Paul my entire life? And now you're blaming me? Paul stepped closer, his gaze icy. You've never taken responsibility for anything. You've exploited Mom and Dad's kindness to satisfy your selfishness. Robert raised a hand to stop Paul, then turned to James, his voice heavy. James, we've been too lenient with you. But that ends now. We won't tolerate this behavior any longer. James scoffed. Oh, and what are you going to do? Kick me out of the house? Robert met his son's eyes firmly. If you don't change, that's entirely possible. Tears welled in Carrie's eyes. You need to learn how to take responsibility, James. If you don't, you'll lose everything. James stood abruptly, his voice raised. Fine. If that's what you all want, I'll leave. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Silence engulfed the house. Paul sighed, turning to his parents. I didn't want this to happen, but he needs to realize his mistakes on his own. Robert nodded, visibly exhausted. We won't go after him. If he wants to come back, it'll have to be on his own terms, with real change. Carrie wiped her tears. I hope James will understand. Paul sat down, feeling for the first time that his family was finally on the right path. There was no more blind favoritism, no more unwarranted indulgence. He felt the fairness he had longed for. A few weeks later, as life began to settle back into a routine, Paul received an unexpected message from James. James, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I want to come home and talk to everyone. Paul stared at the screen, unsure whether to feel hopeful or skeptical. Deep down, he wanted to believe James was genuine. He typed a slow reply. Paul, come home. Mom and Dad are waiting. That evening, James returned. His face no longer bore the arrogance it once did but instead looked weary and remorseful. Robert stood at the door, saying nothing but giving a silent nod. Carrie, with tears in her eyes, gently embraced James. Paul stood in the background, saying nothing, though his expression softened. After all the turmoil, their family finally seemed to be taking steps toward healing. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was markedly different from before. James sat quietly on the sofa, his gaze tinged with regret. Robert sat across from him, his expression stern but less tense than it had been in the past. Carrie moved gently around the room, pouring tea for everyone, trying to ease the tension. Paul leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on James. This was the first time he had seen his brother so quiet, no arrogance, no defiance. Robert was the first to break the silence, his voice firm but calm. James, you said you wanted to come home to talk. So, speak. James lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly together. It took him a moment before he finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. I'm sorry. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Paul raised an eyebrow, not fully convinced. Carrie asked gently, sorry for what, James? James sighed heavily. For everything. For being selfish, irresponsible, and for hurting you, and Paul. Paul said nothing, watching silently. He knew an apology was necessary, but he wanted to see action, not just words. Robert's tone remained firm. James, an apology isn't enough. You need to prove that you truly want to change. James nodded, his gaze steady. I know. I've thought a lot about it. I want to find a stable job and stop relying on you. Paul narrowed his eyes. It was the first time he had heard James talk about independence. Slowly, he spoke. It's easy to say. But are you really serious? James turned to Paul, his tone sincere. I know I've gone too far. I want to start over. Carrie gently held James's hand, tears brimming in her eyes. If you truly want to change, I'll support you. Robert nodded. But I won't tolerate any more mistakes. You'll have to take full responsibility for yourself. James nodded. I understand. Paul sighed softly. He couldn't forgive easily, but at least James had taken the first steps toward change. He hoped it wasn't just empty words. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew lighter. James began taking initiative, helping around the house, assisting their parents, and searching for a job. It was something Paul had never seen before. Paul watched quietly, observing James's actions. For the first time, he felt that perhaps things could truly change. One evening, Paul sat in his study, focused on reviewing documents when James knocked on the door. Come in, Paul said, not taking his eyes off the screen. James entered, holding a stack of papers. I need your help with something. Paul looked up, his expression skeptical. What is it? James hesitated. I'm applying for jobs, but I don't know how to write a resume. Can you show me? Paul stared at his brother for a long moment. If this had been in the past, James would never have lowered himself to ask for help. Paul set his pen down. Hand it over. James sat down across from him, handing over the papers. I know I'm not good at this, but I want to give it a try. Paul took the papers and skimmed through them. The amateur mistakes and chaotic layout made him sigh, but he said nothing. He simply began making corrections. First, you need to clearly state your career objective. Don't ramble, Paul explained, guiding him step by step. James listened intently, nodding. Thanks. Paul smirked slightly. Don't thank me yet. Do the work first, then we'll talk. James chuckled softly. I'll do my best. For the first time in years, Paul sensed genuine effort from his brother. While he wasn't quick to trust, he acknowledged that this was a positive start. Over the next few weeks, James finally landed a job at a small logistics company. It wasn't a prestigious position, but it was one he secured on his own without relying on anyone else. Their parents were thrilled, while Paul quietly observed. One evening, the family gathered for dinner. Carrie beamed as she asked, "James, how's the new job going?" James smiled lightly. "It's okay, Mom. It's not easy, but I feel like I'm doing the right thing." Robert nodded approvingly. "I'm glad to see you taking work seriously." Paul ate silently, but his expression was no longer distant. After the meal, he spoke up. "Where are you working?" James looked surprised but quickly answered. "A small logistics company. The work keeps me busy, but I like it." Paul nodded slightly. "Good. Keep working hard." James smiled. "I won't let you down." Paul didn't respond, but for the first time, he felt a sense of relief. Things weren't perfect, but his family was finally finding its balance again. A month later, the family decided to host a small dinner to celebrate James's progress. It wasn't an extravagant affair, just a simple meal filled with laughter and warmth. During the dinner, Robert raised his glass. "Tonight, I want to toast our family. We've been through tough times, but we've come to understand each other better." Carrie, visibly moved, added, "Family is what matters most. No matter what happens, as long as we're together, it's enough." James lifted his glass, his gaze turning toward Paul. "I want to thank you, Paul. Without you, I wouldn't have realized that I needed to change." Paul was momentarily taken aback but then nodded slightly. "Just make sure you keep your word." The atmosphere in the house was filled with warmth. Paul felt a lightness in his heart, free from resentment. He realized that this family had always been his home, despite the misunderstandings of the past. For the first time in a long while, Paul truly felt happy. The story offers a profound lesson about the value of fairness and appreciation within a family. Favoritism and unchecked indulgence can fracture relationships and hurt those who silently sacrifice. To build a happy family, every member must listen, understand, and acknowledge one another's efforts. Sometimes, change and redemption not only mend relationships but also provide opportunities for personal growth and responsibility.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.